Hello everyone, today we talk about the mask helmets of the early Roman Empire. We will essentially illustrate the various typologies based on Robinson's classification that is naturally approximate, but I think it's still the most famous in here, but it's just a visual approach to the story. And this is as basically all the topics that we deal with way more complicated than this for many reasons, and not much because of the classification in itself naturally can spark all the various critical thinking about the criteria of them, their meaning, etc. It's mostly an archaeologist's thing, right? And the broader topic, though, that would be more interesting to deepen, and maybe one day we will do, is actually framing what the mask helmets in their broader cultural meaning and perspective, right? Because these are part, I would say, of the these types of helmets, at least, of the general, let's say, iconic picture of the Roman Empire. I mean, they're not Roman armored forces of the early empire. They're not excessively famous themselves. I mean, they're definitely something impressive that also evokes certain feelings. I mean, the masks are kind of terrible. They are designed for psychological effect, and that's what you still can feel and find. But in general, we try to we usually attach this stuff to cavalry, right? And to this sort of, sometimes even, as the Anglo-Saxon scholars used to call them, cavalry sports dimension, right? They're in fact usually called cavalry sports helmets. Now, and today we'll see why this is partly limiting. I have nothing against this Anglo-Saxon perspectives of classifications. I use this as without any problems. But let's say that there is a world beyond that, of course, also about which also Anglo-Saxon historiography is perfectly aware of, but not general popular culture all over the world. As we mostly associate this mask, in fact, to cavalry masks, first of all. Tendentially, we also say, well, these were mostly ceremonial stuff, and they were usually impractical and we will see how also this conception has to be framed. But I think that the most important thing that I hope to address one day is what these masks really meant, besides the strictly military meaning of the story. And partly this happens because we tend to still, without any sense, considering the empire as something like modern and secular in our own meaning of the term, right? We still think of this of Roman, especially when we get to the symbolism in this mask of what seems to be and related to equipment, of course, is something that has to be like there only for 100% rational, functional reasons, right? This is partly true in the sense that when you look at this stuff, you have to think that if they were made in a way, obviously they were functional to something, but they were not just functional to mechanical functions, right? There are also psychological dimensions to this, and also very strictly tied to religion as well. This could open a digression, especially on cavalry and the idea of what this world really conceived cavalry about. People generally think that the Romans had kind of lack of interest for cavalry, and this is absolutely false. I mean, even the fact that the Romans didn't have traditionally this large numbers, for example, of cavalry should not let us indulge to believe that the Romans didn't care about their cavalry, nor that the Roman cavalry specifically was bad. This is evident in the earlier Roman Empire, when you have all these auxiliary units integrated from various populations that normally had these equestrian traditions, but it is true also for before. There was actually there are reasons now we can't explain why the Romans developed eventually relatively small bodies of cavalry, of citizen cavalry, that effectively decreased, especially at this point, into the legions that are mostly about infantry fundamentally, and they're just integrated with these foreign elements that are mostly cavalry, lighter troops, etc. But still, the Roman world actually, and and this is really something you don't hear around very much. I can think of certain studies now. I don't remember. There is a French author that made a beautiful PhD about this, but I can't remember his name. But one day I will tell you. But in general, and we can know it essentially knowing also about Roman legions, mythology. I even made a video myself on the Roman archaic cavalry, and that should be that is important in my opinion, because it tells so much about the origins of Roman military culture and also its distinctive traits that once again are so deeply overlooked, because we have to buy the notions that the Romans stole and copied things, but it's a way more complex and fundamentally wrong concept, by the way, in the way at least it's expressed in this sense. Cultural appropriation is nonsense, and this is the truth, and you also have to be as advanced as the person you're assimilating from in order to make things work, because that's what technology is. Technology is not how an object is shaped, but what you do with it. This is called doctrine, especially militarily speaking. That's fundamental. You can't understand the history of the world if you reason in terms of that guy stole that technology. It doesn't work really like that, believe me. But aside from this, there is all this kind of even mystical dimension about cavalry and the legions. And here, in the early Roman Empire, naturally we look at a world that is mixing lots of various traditions. Now, it's not just about the Italic background of the Romans. There is a heavy Hellenization of the empire. There are other Central European populations absorbed by the empire. Other enemies also that contribute to shape or to reinforce, in part at least, the Roman interest in cavalry. That at this time is actually pretty high, right? Because if you see how much the Romans invested in the so-called cohortes equitatae, you realize that the Roman cavalry at this point was pretty damn efficient, right? And the idea that also. Well, okay, let's leave aside the eastern frontier for a while, but, this was pretty damn good cavalry, especially for strictly European, let's say Western European standards, or Mediterranean and European standards. But aside from this, let's get into these mask helmets that, in their origin, in fact, they're not really clear, right? We don't really know how this tradition emerged, or at least, I suspect we know in part, but we should give way more attention to not just to Roman warfare, or at least considering Roman warfare as the place where lots of other influences poured in and were assimilated by the Romans, who created this new synthesis. So similar helmets with this kind of face cover appear every once in a while, actually, also in other military traditions. The Hellenic one, the Etruscan one, the Persian one, right? And these are all cultures that now the Romans have more or less ancient contacts with. Like, as we were saying before, the Romans expand in a largely Hellenistic world, that it's not Hellenic proper, that means it's Hellenized and also is influenced by these forms of warfare. You do find the Hellenistic tradition war masks. You find them, I don't know, think about the Seleucid cataphracts, but probably this also existed elsewhere. The Etruscans, Rome, in institutional terms, is born as an Etruscan city, right? There were these different ethnicities. Actually, were mainly Latins, Sabines, partly Greeks, but also this solid Etruscan component that shapes Rome as a political body, actually, and the military tradition is shared, right? And there is also a broader picture of the world, like, that they were essentially all Villanovians at the end of the day, in spite of the Indo-European and then this Etruscan injection into the Italian peninsula. I would say that, and that's why I want to expand on the topic in the future, that you can find lots of ritual masks in Italic warfare, or in Italian warfare if you want, because at this point we're not talking just about the strictly Italic peoples, but also the Etruscans that are part of the Italian peninsula as a whole. So that would be interesting to analyze. And also the Persian one. And if you actually look, and this is what also a key of interpretation that I would like to use today, is that, as you know, I'm not for a great lover of sharp distinctions, and especially not between the ancient world and the Middle Ages. And if you look at the Middle Ages, in which today we will, for example, do assimilate, I mean, comparing at least, for example, the Hippica Gymnasia to the medieval to the tournaments that we know in the Middle Ages, but also looking at other cultures, especially in the Eastern world, in the Middle Eastern world, even in the Far Eastern world, or the steppes, did have masks, right? Mask helmets that were used, and also for functional reasons. If you really think about the medieval knight, he has this enclosed helmet, right? From the 12th, 13th century, you have that basically the helmet that was traditionally opened in front on the face is closed, right? So this will serve also to make certain considerations about the function of these helmets that I suspect was not really just ceremonial. And by the way, I would like to point out that I'm not here to act in a kind of cathedratic way. Obviously, these are things that are widely known. Historiographically, I'm not really making a lot of I'm just disclosing part. But let's say that to me, as you know, it's very important what it's usually received, and the the simple words that are, or definitions or considerations that are used, that go around and people stop to that because maybe they don't care. But I think that putting the terms in a bit more of a problematic way helps to broaden the perspective, and then ultimately to create curiosity to go deeper into that. So talking about these masks in general, and we don't really know where they came from, meaning that obviously they probably originated in some specific military tradition, appeared sometimes at some point, right? It's obvious that several peoples in the world might have started to use them in general, because if anything, because the mask is always there. I mean, anthropologically speaking, for religious needs, etc., people have always kind of used masks at one point in their cultures, in their religious rites and so on. And the religious element, as I was saying before, is never to be overlooked. We're talking about a world where religion permeates literally every single aspect of human life, right? So thinking, as I was saying before, the Roman Empire, the secular empire, is opposing it maybe to later Christianity, is kind of fantasy. But aside from this, it's very important to understand what the masks means. And actually the masks also protects the face, hides the face, or at least that is also important. Not showing the fact that maybe in combat you could be bleeding and crying, and not be seen like by the enemy like that, but still having this kind of impassible face that is dreadful and terrifying. And these psychological aspects are pretty damn crucial when you're in front of someone, when you want to kill each other. They're really, really crucial. And it's in a nutshell, like, the idea of even of replicating the face is something you find not just in masks, but even on shields, on cuirasses, and so on. So it's really out there. And never forget even the kind of Indo-European idea of impersonification that now we will. That is not just Indo-European, it's totemic in general, or better, well, totemism implies even a certain descendants, but the idea that you can't wear animal skins, and this is literally everywhere in the world, right? I'm talking about the Indo-Europeans because I believe that there is a crucial importance, especially in cavalry, in the development of, I would say, European, but not just European, in fact, cavalries. Even if I think about the Achaemenids, that were originally, at least the original nucleus of Medes were Indo-Aryans in some ways, that gave to the mask in this sense, coupled with the cavalryman and the horse, of course, a deeper meaning, right? Even if you take the Aryan, when he talks about the Sarmatians, this men that looked like dragons, right? Because they had this scale armor that make them look like these fishes, right? And that's all our tradition. Even the migration era comes from the Arthurian legions. This idea that that is in many ways also the base of what we call medieval cavalry, as if the Middle Ages created a new concept, but much of that was already present before, and it's really just a re-injection. Even into Western Europe, where partly, the peoples had largely sedentarized and therefore didn't have this quite strong equestrian traditions, at least numerically, but also technically speaking, compared to the Eastern, steppes. Still, there is this pre-existence, this permanence into it. So it's very difficult to, especially in the ancient world that is so deeply multicultural, and all these military influences get mixed so much, and and there is also I would say a shared military ethos at the end of the day, right? In the Middle Ages you have Christianity kicking in that kind of tends to distinguish this. The military ethos, making even, made a video on St. Paul and Militia Christi, for example, but let's say distinguishing, accepting the idea of the militia, but kind of distinguishing it from what, the spiritual militia and the earthly militia. It doesn't matter where, things like crusades happen, conceptually the thing is there. But so that kind of complicated story. But the ancient world was really the realm, like every single state, basic, or tribe or empire, basically had more or less rationalized the idea that the ultimate goal of theirs was to conquer the whole world, right? This is particularly important, that there is no limit in this sense. People believed that the winner had a right to conquer, and once you destroyed one enemy, you had the right to rule on them, simply because they thought that victory is not human. It's something that descends from the celestial deity of the sky, of war, in which also, in this sense, the especially in the European mythology, had a lot to do with horses, right? And that's something you find, in fact, even into Hellenic mythology, into Roman mythology. I mean, populations that now were substantially far from the origin of the steppe, right? But this is why it's remarkable, because this is a sort of re-elaboration of traditions that probably they didn't even know to have had, right? We don't have to think the Romans, let's say in the 2nd century AD, actually understood where they came from. Like the real Roman religion, I mean the real one that they had before they assumed this adaptation from the Hellenic religion, at least in its most structured form, because also Hellenic religion was extremely varied and fragmented. There is no thing like a real pantheon, for example. They didn't really know what it was about. And that was the few things that we know about Roman archaic culture really point at the direction that the Romans were much about this past memory of, especially, and this importance of horsemen as warriors and as freemen, right? Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. And I like to stress these concepts because I believe that they're incredibly forgotten. Many people even think it's controversial, but whoever is into anthropology, ethnography, and ethnology knows what you're talking about. There's nothing really strange about it. But one of the reasons why it's controversial is that it's not really told, so I take the chance to always remind it. What we can say from a strictly, say, social point of view, aside from the religious aspect, it is definitely important, the impersonation, the personification, right, through the mask, and the assumption of this spirit, if you want, of the represented being. At a social level, when we look at these mask helmets, definitely we see one thing, especially in this case in the early Roman Empire, but also before, because it's essentially plate armor, is that they are very costly. Right, and they're also very elaborated and decorated, which is part of the reason why it's been said these were chiefly ceremonial stuff, because they were definitely expensive, right? This was the fruit of the work of very skilled craftsmen that could that were working for unitly on commission for people, for initially even warriors in this more ancient dimension, but now evidently in a more professional and statalized system, that with a military administration and so on, for however particularly well-off people with elevated social condition, right? Just like in the Hellenic world, it could be the Hippies, or in the Roman world, the Equites. This is interesting because you see that between the Greeks and within the Greeks and the Romans, this idea of horsemanship was actually pretty alive, right? The fact that the Greeks and the Romans had mostly infantry armies. This is a political and social product, but at a cultural level, there was still the idea that the cavalrymen had been something, and theoretically was still about something. Like the Roman knights, especially, were in the sensual classes pretty damn, advantage, or at least there is also this idea that the state had to pay for some of them the horses, which is pretty strange because actually the Republican, let's say the democratic idea that you have to contribute with your own weapons, equipment for the army, for the legion in this case, it was considered a duty, and these forms of privilege towards the state, towards particular people that are already kind of well off, basically, like the knights, it was seen like a kind of an aristocratic idea that, as you know, both in the Hellenic and the Roman world was theoretically opposite to democratic direction. This also tells you how it wasn't really cent for cent like that, and how also we made a lot of mythology about it, which is a mistake. But also how the knight proper was still, filled with all these symbolisms and eddas and etc. Another thing I should say about the price of these masks is that also during the early Roman Empire, we basically think that at this time the Roman army was all basically a salaried entity, right? It's the idea that fundamentally now the state pays people to fight, right? It's usually the Roman citizen that could hire, enlist in the legions, naturally did it for this salary. The auxiliaries, that is the foreigners, did it for earning the citizenship in part, but I think they were also rewarded, of course. They were, and so, but we often forget at one point, even that, even in terms of means of production, at the end of the day, you could have a pretty large degree of equipment's customization, right? Probably there were stricter rules, because what we see from Roman legionary equipment, especially, we see that there is a solid uniformation. This is a controversial concept, because there is always a person who says, well, these weren't really uniforms. No, they weren't. In fact, the modern concept of uniform, of course, it wasn't there, for sure. But still, it was pretty homogenized in the equipment, in the typologies, etc. But the idea is, the concept of uniform here also doesn't exist, simply for the reason that it was enough to bear arms in order to be recognized as a military man in the civil world. The Roman military had some, advantages, and in civilian life as well. They had certain privileges. I don't know, they etc. But the concept still is that you could. There are also other reasons now that I don't explain. It's also about what warfare at the time really was, what the enemies or the empire really were. There was some sort of, I made a video about this, like, I don't remember how it was titled, but it's essentially about the colors. I think Roman, I don't remember, something about shield colors, stuff like that, or the legionary infantry that deals with these things. There are other reasons, even including psychologically, that is just at the same level, like wearing a mask, wearing same color, that is important even for an impact on the enemy. It's never to be underestimated. it's probably about these helmets that Arian, in his on Tactics 34, describes in this occasion of this spectacular exhibitions of Roman cavalry, known as Hippica Gymnasia. That is, it's basically it's actually it really means basically the horseman, the horse, and consequently horseman training, right? Exercise, and it defines these helmets like covering the face of the knight from every side, and they are open in correspondence to the eyes, so that the eyes can be protected without impeding the sight, the vision, right? So this is important because first of all, we don't have the there is some like iconographical evidence that these helmets were used in the occasion of Hippica Gymnasia, right? These were we will have to make a video about this, as we were saying before. They were kind of like horsemanship games. You can't say tournaments, meaning using the term tournament even in the actual and much broader meaning that it really had. When we think about tournaments, we think just about like the late medieval form with the stake in the middle, the thing, but everything was pretty much regulated. But let's say that this cavalry training was proper at the end of the day, not just of the Roman army, of course, but also at every other population out there. Like every society, more or less structured way, carried out this cavalry training as a form of competition, also of social competition, not just a mere within an armed context. Of an army context, meaning that the majority of states, of populations out there didn't quite have a state, so it was the society keeping itself in shape from a military point of view up to a certain point by practicing in this way. Even the hoplites at one point had some minimal training in occasion of these festivals, etc. In spite of they refused professionalism as the same founding ground of the political meaning, the civic meaning of the polis, right? With the exception of Sparta, the usual exception of Sparta. But it's normal. Like it's a way to keep in shape with arms and weapons in a world that is normally kind of violent. Even within the Roman Empire, really many communities actually had maintained their own militias, right? It was useful. It was useful for the empire itself, for controlling, for defending, etc. So you have to think of a world that shared a lot in this sense, and where, by the way, also things were not so dramatically different from place to place, really. And these games were practiced by every people I can think of. Like obviously the Romans did it. Obviously, even pre-Roman peoples did it. I don't know. The Gauls were all they had this terrific love for cavalry, even though, contrary to what is usually said, they didn't quite have a good cavalry. The Germans used that, even if the Germans are not considered to have had lots of cavalry, especially in the early times. But it was everywhere. Think about North Africa, that had this very intense horsemanship traditions that produced, in fact, some of the best cavalry of the whole empire. But naturally, also the Danubian, let's say the even the Sarmatian region, etc. And for not talking about the east, where horsemanship has always been quite of a thing. But I don't have to recall this. The important is here that, of course, the mask had this eye slits for which people could, the horsemen could see through. So obviously, at least we know that these were actually worn in whatever activity it was concerned, which is, it sounds pretty obvious, but this was a world also where there were lots of fake masks, even for tanking the deities or making other kind of personifications, etc. So obviously we know that these are also for the size, the skull cap, etc. That these helmet masks were actually employed by cavalry, right? Now we will try to understand whether they were actually used in real combat, which I think so, really. So what is interesting about this mask helmets is also that naturally they were a precious element of the panoply, right? They were pretty, as we were saying before, just the elite could do. I think I didn't complete the topic, but let's say that there was probably well segmentation even within units that were thought to be kind of standard. I mean, even if you take the legion and the cohorts, you can find within them there are differences. Like usually there were certain cohorts. I mean, these are conjectures, but it's not really surprising. I mean, we don't really know much about the Roman army for real. Like we think we know everything about we actually don't. We don't really know how the actual organization, how the actual engagement was, but we can imagine that within the same units, even within the same cohort, that actually even after the Marian reform remained split, administratively speaking, in 3 manifolds, right? And naturally the centuries probably had differences in equipment. Like it's possible that a cohort was kind of heavier than another, or that there were certain troops naturally within the same units, even at the smallest tactical level, that had these differences. What we have to think is that aside from this personal customization deriving from maybe that legionary was richer and could afford really to have the local smiths to have something made for him, but that there was this interchangeability of equipment, right, for which basically in the Roman army every single soldier could use every single kind of weapon. I mean, for real. Like it's obvious that there were this functional standardizations for which forced of course Roman legionary heavy infantry was about the famous armor, the shield, the gladius, and the pila and so on. But especially in the auxiliary units, there were also incidentally the ones that were much more intensely engaged compared to the Roman legionary, because they did the dirty job that obviously the legionary were left kind of out from, because they would have taken too much casualties and they were too expensive compared to the auxiliaries, right? Were more expandable. Obviously, on auxiliary, you could even use kind of legionary equipment. I mean, it's perfectly normal. The myth that, for example, the auxiliaries didn't use the so-called segmented armor. Why? What's the evilness of this? It doesn't make any sense. But aside from this, which is kind of widely known at this point in historiography, there are also some other artistic elements that can, however, also help us to understand that world, that the cultural world that we were talking about before, really. Because these face masks, mask helmets were usually reproducing the appearance of heroic characters like Alexander the Great, from history in this case, but also mythical ones like the great heroes of the Iliad, or these other Greeks that fought against the Amazons and so on. You see here history and myth that mix up. This was normal for the ancient world, really. I mean, naturally myths had generated now in moments that were much less secularized than this world had actually become. Naturally, before I said that this was not a secular world at all, which is true because it was literally all about religion. But let's say that now these Mediterranean civilizations had developed enough to kind of rationalize many aspects of their lives, so they kind of now lived into the aesthetical tradition, even sometimes, of these myths, etc. And the fact that the appearances of such mask helmets represent such figures is no surprise. So here we get to the point that these helmets, some say, they were impractical to use in combat. Now, Okay, let's assume it is the case, because you know what? Everything that that wakes and has, say, reduces your senses, like hearing and and sight, partly, and breath. By the way, never forget this. We will look at various types now that have all these, also mouth slates, for example, are something more. But at the end of the day, this is just like a plate armor on your face, right? First of all, it costs a lot, right? And all these decorations now we will observe are objectively, we see a tendency, which I perfectly agree with, that for which we can assume that this stuff was used prevalently, or preferably at least, with a ceremonial function. But I really don't see why this should be considered not to have been used into fight. There is one element, though, that can be maybe a hint of this, because actually I can see it. Let me check, telling the truth, that as far as I see, these helmets, aside from maybe one, but not maybe all of them, do not have ear openings. Now, this is something that at one point starts happening even with certain types of helmets for infantry during the 3rd century, where there are lots of changes that also are fairly not so difficult to explain, but there's still a halo of conjecture, right, about this stuff. But the fact that there was no hearing, you would say, well, maybe this guy is, especially for cavalry, hearing is pretty damn important, because tactically speaking, the thing is way more dynamic. And it does require this stuff. It's true that maybe a better protection is advised in general, as it's true, telling the truth, that if you look at medieval helmets, like the great helmets, etc., you realize they didn't have ear openings. And that was the same as well. So actually, I believe that this is also kind of no proof, no valid hint to say, okay, well, this was not truly used in combat, because in combat you need to hear orders. It really depends on many aspects of the story. And I would really like to know more, for example, about what we know, logically speaking, about the necessity of, let's say, the intensification of cavalry combat, that really at this time in the early empire was really a thing in many ways, especially considering that the Roman cavalry could equip its, the Roman army could equip its cavalry with this kind of heavier equipment, right? This is a moment in which the Romans start even to imitate the Parthian cataphracts. There is a lot of experimentation side of cavalry, and surely on the frontiers, a lot of combat with peoples that were pretty good damn horsemen. The Parthians, as we mentioned, but also the Sarmatians that we reminded before. And even on other frontiers, cavalry was fundamental, right? Even though, as we know at this time, infantries were kind of more important still. But I could add more. Let's, however, start giving a look at the actual types on Robinson's classification. And I would pass, okay, I mark the moment of the recording to the type A. Here I think I put you this beautiful example of mask helmet of A type this is from Belgrade, at the Archaeological Museum of Belgrade, if you prefer, I don't know, yeah, Belgrade in English. This is very interesting because it comes really from the 1st century BC, as I think it's dated to so early. This is interesting because it's actually very similar, as far as I remember, to the Seleucid face elements. The Seleucid Empire actually vanishes at this. It's already declined since the beginning of the 7th century BC because of Roman expansion. But it's Pompey that puts an end to it, telling the truth, officially. So this is a realistic and plausible and very probable Hellenistic provenance, right? Prominence, sorry. And it's interesting because this face helmet is rather realistic, right? You can see all the various features, etc. It's, I mean, practically it's formed by two bronze molded laminae, right? That are also, by the way, very thin laminate that are jointed at the height of the hairline, and the inferior margins of the shapes are given with a series of holes for the seaming of an internal padding that always existed in this armor. Like, it's no just medieval stuff. Like, always armor had something underneath that was used to absorb the hit, and sometimes made a terrific job, really, because the risk of an internal trauma, even if the armor is not pierced, is always there. That can make miracles. Actually, underneath and also over the same armor, by the way. Then passing to the B type, we see here instead this is dated to the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century AD, so we are far later at this point, of more than 1 century at least, from A type. It's made of bronze, and it's characterized by a visor that has a tendentially triangular form and is markedly projected towards, upwards. And the skull is very rich in decorations, as you can see. It has these reliefs, and it ends up with a neck guard, some modest width, while the mask's envelopes completely the face, and reproducing this pretty realistic, also in here, human features, but also a series of motifs and decorations on the superior part. And eventually the mask was hooked to the skull in the internal upper side, and it was kept in firm through a strap or tie rod in leather. And this is known as, in fact, the type B, but also rib chester. And it's this time I think it's preserved in London at the British Museum. So passing instead, so here 34, okay, to C type. Now this is also a bit more problematic to date because the time span is like between the 1st century and the 3rd century AD, and there are numerous types of this category that have been found both in iron and in bronze, that were at this point basically the major metals were used, and the mask of this helm reproduces normally this category of a youthful face, basically framed within a pretty showy hair in relief on the frontal side, and this motif is also repeated on the cap as well. And unfortunately, of most of the samples, of the exemplars that have survived, we have only the mask, right? So this was a separated piece together with the skull cap, right? And this one I show to you is in the picture is also from British Museum in London. So passing to the D type, I'm okay, 2.03, excuse me, it's the D type. This is dated instead to the end of the 1st century and the end of the 2nd century AD, and it's distinguished by the presence of a horizontal hinge that joins the mask to the rest of the skull cap. And this picture I've put here There are others. There is a beautiful one from of which we have only the face plate that comes from the X collection Axel Gutmann. This one that I show you here is actually from Nijmegen at the museum Het Valkhof. So passing to the E-type, we have here this is dated to the end of the 1st century and the 3rd century AD, so this is going also fairly far this point. So and it basically contains a series of helmets that are realized exclusively in bronze, and that represents female faces. And the sense of this is probably these helmets were used to represent, to interpret, to figure the mythical Amazons during the Hippica Gymnasia, right? So here the Amazons, you see here the mythology of this world of stuff. You know that the Amazons basically are the Hellenic interpretation of the Scythian horse maidens, like that were meant according to tradition. You know, that's also complicated, a chapter we have to explain, and it's but they existed actually, so they were correct. Naturally, the Greeks interpreted the story of the Amazons as, you know, sort of a model of barbarity in the world, where the world was kind of upside down, and this the mythology of this community of women that lived without men, just copulating every once in a while to maintain the group, and saving only the female children. Well, the males were killed actually. And this beautiful helmet here showed an Amazon, and it comes from it's known as it's part of the E-type, also known as a Schwerpunkt type, and this is instead preserved at the Archäologische Museum of München in Germany. So passing to the F-type, here it's 517. Okay, sorry, that's just my counting, don't worry. So this is the F-type. It's been dated at the late 2nd century AD, and as you see here, it presents the particular element of this sort of additional faceplate that is actually created into the mask in corresponding to the area eyes, nose, mouth. And it's as if there was an internal mask, as you see, that is framed within the structure of the skull cap. It's not like a separated thing like the one we saw before. So it's actually a more resistant structure. And this internal mask was probably hooked with a pin. The pivot, a frontal pivot, actually, that could and therefore could be, you know, fairly easily removed. And this particular exemplar is from Stuttgart at the Württembergisches Landesmuseum. And the F-type is also known as Prondorf type. So passing to the G-type. Wait a second. We have here, it's dated between the late 2nd and the 3rd century AD. It's characterized by this great crest that is incorporated within the skull, within the cap, and that usually represents a stylized eagle, as you can see. Naturally, the eagle was the symbol of the celestial deity of the sky, not just for the Romans actually, but for so many peoples, Europeans and not. And so the meaning here is particularly clear. Actually, if you remember the F-type also, that had a eagle to it. So it was not just a symbol of the Roman Empire; it was the broader perception of the divine glory, right? It's like the Greek, the Hellenic Nike, for example. It's the same thing. They came all from the same culture. This is the beauty, if you want, of these cultures. And this, and if you look at the skull, it's projected inward. Towards, ahead, and it imitates. There is a protrusion that imitates the pseudo-Corinthian helmet. You can't see. The pseudo-Corinthian helmet was this thing that basically was meant to represent a visor, but it wasn't quite functional, right? It was just a decoration. It was a way to also in there portray a model of something else, model of a warrior that theoretically could raise the helmet over the head, but at that point becomes kind of a pure aesthetics, but just not pure aesthetics, but also reinforcing naturally, in this case, the upper side of the helmet, right? It's more metal in there. It's like an additional plate that is pretty useful, right? It's obviously has a higher weight, it's more costly, so it's those are the cons, but in battle the pros are also pretty evident. And in this case, actually, it's not just about the visor. You can't see an actual face on the over the visor. Let's say that even in the pseudo-Corinthian models, you didn't quite have a face, did you? You had just the opening of the Corinthian helmet in the middle, right? So here it's interesting because it's beyond that. This is also part of a kind of a further personification of some deity or some character, etc. And in this exemplar that comes from the Archaeological Museum of Frankfurt in Germany, you can see that the mask basically leaves uncovered, actually, the face, especially in the area between the eyes and the mouth, including the nose. There seemed to be no nasal defense, for example. And however, there are traces of a internal mask that is similar to the one that is characteristic of the F-type. So it probably was pretty similar to that. So there was an internal mask within the skull. Okay. Then, passing to the H-type. Let me check. Okay. This is dated to the 3rd century AD. It's also known as Worting type, or Worting type, actually. And it's similar to the G1, but it's kind of less elaborated. For example, it's without the pseudo-Corinthian visor, and it has a less imposing crest. This particular type should here depicted, this particular exemplar here depicted should come from Norwich, the Castle Museum. And passing then to the I-type, we have instead a general profile that evidently recalls those characteristics typical of the Attic elm type, such as the high front, the high forehead, we can't say here. Here you see naturally the eagle as well. These other animals represented around. It's quite important, and it's part of that mythology, that religious symbols and of the empire, the divinities, etc. And you can see that there is an additional cover for the ears, right? Because this is, let me check a bit the picture more in detail because I'm actually not looking at it right now. And you can see here that ears are, in fact, are still covered, so the thing we were noticing before, yet they are reinforced. Now it's not excessively clear, you know, if there is no ear. Usually, you know, those Actic helms types or other Roman legionary helmets, other helmets from everywhere, actually were they had this ear opening, right? And the fact that here it's clear, and there is usually a rim, a reinforced rim around the ear that, although, you know, open, you know, exposed, was fairly well protected still. Here instead it's closed, but you find that same pattern of reinforcement around the place where the ear should be uncovered. And part of the reason is that this is still an element of strengthening, right? Aside from the ceremonial aspect of the story that could make this helmet really impractical and heavier. Yeah, this is kind of a relatively impractical helmet for real. But it could also be seen as a reinforcement to protect a pretty critical area of the human head, that is the temple, that, as you know, is pretty fragile. And, you know, getting a blow, even, you know, with all the padded coat, let's say, underneath, and through the metal, it's not easy. Like, if you get an axe hit like that has a trauma effect, it's freaking dangerous. So still kind of makes sense, right? It could be partly aesthetic, but in practice the functionality remains the same, the logic remains the same. So it's interesting to see that as impractical as these helmets can be, but they still don't add things that are kind of senseless, right? And even actually the animals here depicted, the eagle, what is he here, the lion as well, yes, the lion is still part of you know, scaring the enemy in some ways, or at least representing something that for the ethos of these warriors, even if it was just ceremonial, it was important, right? It was not just a way, even you know, a belief. I have to take it as a religious belief as well, but it's not also in there looking impressive, looking, you know, dangerous, fierce. I mean, it's important in a battle. Usually something that makes you look taller. Generally, you can see it in the military still today, still used, right? And I mean, today, obviously, at a ceremonial level, because, you know, ever since we had, you know, since the second half of the 19th century, rifle technology didn't make it very favorable to look, I mean, to be exposed by, you know, a headgear that could be very visible. But all military history previous to that, even in times of firearms, actually, you know, could so the functionality of looking kind of more showy, in fact, and to claim in part even this kind of say, I don't care that I look, I want to show myself up, because that's the kind of the fighter slash also warrior ethos that is so it's part of this idea of not hiding, of course, and to be recognized, because it was a kind of a personal matter theory, right? Now, as we were saying, this is a particularly, you know, kind of rationalized, in part secularized context, but still the Roman soldier has that ancient tribal pride ethos that doesn't matter how choked now by discipline and training, but the collective training, but it's still there. So it's really not something that was erased from the Romans. And technically speaking, I think that the statal forms of the ancient world couldn't really erase, right? Like modern centralized states. So it's important still. And as we were noticing, the eye type is distinguished by a series of these massive relief decorations that represent animals or mythical scenes, while the frontal mask is basically hinged at the size, and it becomes too. It's basically substituted, like in the attic, with this cheek protection that that are also as heavily decorated. So what can we say? There is also the J type that here we don't really show, but that in fact it belongs to the late 3rd century, so it's very late in time, and is in fact represented only one exemplar that has been found in Romania, and the skull is molded on the base of a Phrygian helmet with the superior terminal of a crested eagle. And there are other types of categorization, of classification, actually, other criteria. For example, there is the Collard type that regrouped the mask helmets according to the following typology. Basically, it's 5 typology. So that basically are all matching actually same certain Robinson types. So it's actually simpler. But they match basically the same thing. So the first type would be Robinson D type, that is helmets with this hinge at the height of the forehead. The second type are these 1st century AD helmets with a hinge in the middle of the skull. The third type, these are 3 pieces helmets with an internal mask. It would be the Robinson F type. Type 4 would be Robinson's A type helmets with a skull and mask in a single piece. Then we have the 5th type. There are helmets that would be Robinson C type helmets of the 2nd and 3rd century with a hinge in the mid of the skull cap. And the 6th type would be Robinson's E type helmets with a female mask. Alright, so this was it basically, and at least I'm not engaged into more recent historiography here, but I think that as I was saying before, that the Robinson classification is still, it's still useful to know, at least because many books still have it, and so I would stop here without adding much more. I think that most of the things I had to say relatively to these types of helmets have been said, and what the mask really meant. So this combination functionality of protection, of aesthetics, of symbolism, right? All these ancient mythical traditions mixed with religion, etc. And I think it does make sense. And so these were obviously very expensive stuff, and some of them is really impractical in some ways, but at the same time I don't think they were really just used for the Epica Gymnasia, so it would be the Roman this form of tournament, right? You know that the Romans basically made these spectacles even in the arenas, etc., arenas that they built outside their cities, and they were usually built outside because they didn't want too many people to assemble in one place. It was kind of dangerous at the time because they could make a revolt or something. And the legionnaires basically entertained the people. It's kind of cool, and it's a way to train as well. So it's that's that simple and functional at the same time. But really, these things were probably used in combat as well, right? First of all, even the same army that is used on the field has the need to look kind of fearsome. Like the mask is fearsome. It's something that makes you freeze. It's basically this emotionless enemy in front of you. And remember, concealing the face is really an important thing. If you're crying because of stress, because of anxiety, because of fear, etc., you don't show it to the enemy. You have just someone you can't see the face. It's terrible, because as humans we're always meant to evolutionarily speaking, to fight against someone you could look at. Even if it's an animal, you can't actually look at what the facial expression is really about. Instead, looking at a mask is terrifying. And then I would say that there are the same Aryan, actually, when he talks about the Sarmatians, the Alans, he talks about, but there are many other sources, we know it from many other, much other evidence of this, cavalrymen of the steppes that were covered in iron from head to toe. So what was the cataphract really about? It was also about that. So you have your whole body covered with armor, with metal armor. So why wouldn't you protect your face as well? I think we have too much emphasized the fact that, that this cavalry's helmets are kind of, impractical. Are we sure? I mean, I would feel more confident to have in a fight my face protected by a metal plate rather than nothing. And that is true. That reduces your sight, your hearing. But that's something you find even in medieval knight. That is the greatest cavalry. The most professional and effective and dynamic cavalry type, and that wasn't a problem for them. Like, yeah, they had their squires maybe to shout at them from look left, look right, giving like in a tank crew, because it was like being within a tank, but it's still protective. I mean, if it means to cover your face, why not? And then you could say, but do we have evidence of this for infantry too? Not direct, but a cavalryman can simply also fight on foot. Like, you don't have to stay on horseback all the time. And in general, there is also this idea that, the heavier the cavalry is, and the less it has to really do as an individual fighter. Explain myself better. When you have very light cavalry, that has to be very reactive most of the times. So it's probably a lot about individual initiative in some way. So you have to look around without seeing everything around you, turning, not being annoyed by this armor around you. And also probably you have to react quickly to orders, so you have to have also your ears uncovered, etc. But this ultra heavy cavalry that the Romans are also building, imitating the Parthians. We have seen how these helmets are dated up to the second, even 3rd century AD. So in a moment where the Romans were doing this at this point, you have to think that the heavier cavalry is, and the more what really matters is staying in the formation and working as a solid formation, basically to overwhelm the enemy with the thickness of it, and without really having to get into the thick melee individually. Also, we know that in fact this happened with the Parthians as well, that when they had this big shock effect, but when they charged frontally without support, without having softened up the enemy Roman legionary formation, I mean, they were burdened and made and hampered and hindered by their own armor. They couldn't move, and they could be just pulled down from the horse and killed in that way. So that partly explains it. So in my opinion, really, I'm really pro the idea that aside from these masks, that some of which are very elaborated, and it could have been really ceremonial, there would be nothing strange. At the same time, making the case that this is either just ceremonial and nothing else, it kind of also doesn't make sense with what even war was conceived like, ceremonially speaking. And this is particularly important because you find, for example, face masks, for example, used even about among the infantry, for example, for these kind of NCOs, these principales, like the signifer, for example, etc. So that means that there is a face, a character, a figure you have to represent on the battlefield, because it has to intimidate the enemy in some way, or it has to be better protected as well. So it's like a bit of a combination. So it wouldn't be so strange, really, that this was the case. That these masks were mask helmets were used in actual warfare, in actual combat. And it kind of makes sense also because, as I was saying before, cavalry warfare was consistently increasing at this time. I mean, especially during the 2nd century, the 3rd century, but not only. I mean, even before it was hard. But even all these populations of the frontiers of Iranic origin, etc., are pretty damn good horsemen, right? And when you have a contest being pointed at you by a cavalryman who is charging against you, you may want to have your face protected. Also because usually the enemy was aiming either at your chest or your face, right? And we know even from medieval history, for example, that basically the reason why the helmet came to be closed on the face was because the knights caused to each other obviously these horrendous and almost likely mortal wounds in the face, and sometimes you have these horrendous wounds even with the spear actually passing through the eye slit that naturally had to be left open because otherwise the knight could have not seen anything. Another risk was the helmet could rotate with a very heavy blow and that you would be blinded in the process, because the eye slits would shift from your eyes axis, so side axis. So it's I think I see a lot of analogies to this, and I'm aware that actually it doesn't end here, in the sense that from the Roman history we don't have such massive material that is archaeological or documentary, also in the iconographic evidence that these helmets were so spread. But it's obvious that when you start using heavily armored cavalry with even cataphract fashion, why shouldn't be the face covered at that point? So it's perfectly normal. Really, it's normal that this belongs to the elite. As we've seen, they were pretty expensive plate armor at the end of the day, and plate armor has always had that function at the end of the day. It doesn't matter how elaborated it was. Also in medieval times there were tournament armor, but theoretically it was something especially that was clearly distinguished towards the very late Middle Ages in some ways. But the one that was used in previous centuries normally was perfectly usable also into fight. And as I said before, even in that context, tournaments were not that different. If anything, for sheer physical forces involved into the process to real war. And what would you train for, by the way, if you don't train for real war? We know that Roman military training, as Flavius Josephus says, was just, the same thing as battle. As harsh as it was, so that the Romans would consider battles just like trainings where they shed a bit of blood, basically. More, I would say. So it's, I think it can be interpreted that way, but it's obvious at the same time, and this is also to not to be forgotten, that this was not, in spite of all the mythical and cultural influences that existed in these worlds from the past of the semi-nomadic populations they came from, they also, where they had at least inherited the this military ethos from, mostly. These were not actually equestrian militaries, right? We have seen with the Roman army, also with the Hellenic armies, it wasn't mostly about horsemen, like in the Middle Ages, where the feudal elite was dominating and therefore also represented itself. Here, cavalry was kind of accessory. I mean, it was necessary, but it was in the second ground. In fact, the Parthians or the Sassanids, for example, that had instead sort of feudal society at the end of the day, they represented their cavalry equipment definitely, I mean, relatively more, also given their level of civilization development than the Romans or the Greeks had done, right? So I actually wouldn't be surprised to see that other European peoples, for example, like the Celts or the Germans, use this stuff. Oh, by the way, I'm definitely sure the Iberians used masks that you can say, well, this is ceremonial. They could be used like that, as we have seen the Etruscans did it as well. So it's normal in many ways that at this point do not even need to be explained, because we have said what the reason was. So these are my thoughts. They're nothing particularly original, but I hope they make sense in general too, and especially that they can make people grow people more aware about these topics in general, more curious at least, and looking from these topics something more, something more in depth to them. So, okay, for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next.